don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Erik Francis, who is the author of a book titled Inquiring Minds Want to Learn, posing good questions to promote student inquiry. As you might imagine, we had lots to talk about, as I am obviously an inquiry advocate. I tried to play devil's advocate on a few of the issues that I can imagine critics of inquiry or constructivist education might push back on. And we also talked about some of the specifics from his book, but there's lots in the book that we did not talk about. It's always interesting to talk with somebody who works with schools and teachers on inquiry like we do, and to compare notes and think about how we think about inquiry and teaching and learning differently. I'd like to remind you that you can find all of our professional development work, podcasts, and blogs at wegrowteachers.com. There you'll find our work on project-based learning and knowledge-rich inquiry and differentiated instruction, objective pluralism, which is meant to help you navigate some of the culture war issues that are putting external pressures on our K-12 education space, and several other areas in which we help schools grow and better prepare students for the modern world. You can always reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. So with all of that said, here is that conversation with Erik Francis. I'm here with Erik Francis, and we're going to talk about his latest book, Inquiring Minds Want to Learn, posing good questions to promote student inquiry, and probably some other things. But as I generally like to do, I want to give you an opportunity to say hello and share any details that you think are relevant about you. And I'll probably ask some questions that will dive a little deeper. But tell the folks who are listening who you are and what you do and that kind of thing.
Well, thanks, Drew. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for providing the forum here. My name is Erik Francis. I'm an author, educator, presenter, and professional development provider and producer. I've been doing what I've been doing now for the last 12 years, starting in 2012. I've been a middle school and high school teacher, was a site administrator, worked at the state education department out here in Arizona. That's where I am. And 2012, I decided to make the leap to form my own lack of a better word, education consulting company. I don't like to say consulting because that's kind of taken a lot of different meanings. And what I like to say is I come in and I support teachers in increasing their effectiveness and also hopefully increasing student achievement and overall school performance. So written a couple of books, present all around the country, world's starting to open up. So I'll present all around the world, and just very blessed to continue to have this profession and to continue working and have my ideas and strategies considered relevant and helpful out there. So that's pretty much me in a nutshell. My company's called Maverick, Maverik Education. It's named after my daughters, Madison, Avery, and Amanda, and also a child of the 80s. So probably guess what my favorite movie is, Top Gun. And that's pretty much me in a big nutshell.
So you said you were, I think you said middle school teaching. Kind of go back through your teaching experience and like what were you teaching? What was the if you said I apologize, I may have missed it. But what subjects and things were you teaching?
Well, that's the interesting thing. So I'm certified to be an English teacher, and that was my primary assignment. But what I used to do was give up my prep hour to teach out of my content area to make extra money. So when hard to fill positions, I would become one period of a math teacher. One year I'd be a science teacher. And that's where I came up with a lot of my ideas with questioning strategies, because I would be learning all the subjects that I was teaching. I'm not certified in math. I'm not certified in science. I'm not certified in history, but I would be spending my weekends asking questions, learning it, and preparing these PowerPoints and providing the information. And I felt like I was doing more of the work and the learning. So what I just did, and actually some kids have even said to me, well, you're not a math teacher, you're not a science teacher, you're a history teacher. I go, hey, you know what? You're absolutely right. So you know what? You're going to teach me. So using the questioning strategies, I would have the kids go and basically they would acquire the knowledge, apply the knowledge, analyze the knowledge, and augment the knowledge. And they basically took ownership with it. So I would give them just enough to get started, but then I would become like a facilitator of the inquiry, where they would go basically and be able to basically synthesize the knowledge and be able to communicate and explain, justify, and extend their learning. So again, I was primarily an English teacher, and that was another thing, because I would be telling my kids, like, my favorite memory of this was when I said Mark Twain was the original bad boy when I was teaching American Lit, and I got back 90 papers that said Mark Twain was the original bad boy, with one person citing my lecture. So what I was realizing is that I'm just saying stuff and the kids are just regurgitating it back to me. So then what I did was I would ask questions, and I would get the kids to think about why and how and what if, and that's how they started learning deeply. And to tell you the truth, my job got easier because I felt like I was the one who was learning and creating all the lessons and doing all the assignments in terms of administering them and lecturing and overseeing the activities. And when I was asking questions, they started, working harder learning than I was teaching. So that's kind of how I came up with my strategy of questioning that I talk about, my first book and this current book.
Gotcha. And when you were a kid, what was your educational experience like? What kind of schools did you attend? And would you say they were more traditional, progressive, or mix, or what was that like?
I was a public school kid. I grew up in the 70s and 80s. We were very, very content driven. You did what your teachers taught you, and you did what your teachers told you. And if you did that and did not ask any questions, you got an A. Well, I was a questioner, and I realized that my questions were not welcome. I'll never forget math, 7th grade. I still remember the question I asked. I said, when we were learning about how to divide fractions, I said, why do I need to flip the multiplier, make it an improper fraction, turn the whole thing into a multiplication problem? And she said to me, Mr. Francis, ours is not the question why, just invert and multiply. When my teachers taught me what the theme of the story was, and they asked me on the test, what's the theme of the story, I had to recall back what they said. So I did school, and I did school just enough. I was savvy enough to know that if I just did my homework and if I just did my assignments, I'll pass with a B. I was not very engaged in school. I was not very encouraged in school. I think that's part of the reason why I became a teacher, because I wanted my kids and my students, and I wanted the experience to not only be educational, but also enjoyable, be something that was memorable, not just for an exit ticket out the door or to pass a test, but something that they would take to them. And it's funny because I still talk to many of my students through social media, and 20, 30 years later, they're still remembering stuff that I taught them in class. And that's true learning. And I try to make it not only educational, enjoyable for them, but also educational, enjoyable for me. There's nothing wrong for me to enjoy why I'm teaching, how I'm teaching, what I'm teaching. So that's kind of how I did my whole thing. It was basically, hey, you may not be having fun with this, but man, I'm enjoying the heck out of it, just teaching you with this and learning with you.
And then your teacher preparation, you mentioned being certified, I think in English, ELA, or whatever that label might be. What was that like, and to the extent that you thought it was good or bad? Because as I'm sure you're well aware, many people would characterize their teacher education certification process as not being particularly good. Certainly not always the case, but I'm curious about yours.
It's interesting. I came in through teaching through the back door. This was not my first chosen profession. I actually left the profession I wanted to be in, which I was working in. I was working actually in the film industry, and I left and I became a teacher. But I did my first year of teaching while I was also learning how to be a teacher, taking courses. What I found a lot of it was a lot of theory. I'll never forget, this is the mid 90s. I'll never forget, somebody showed a picture of this student with a mohawk and earrings in his nose, and he looked like, lead singer of the Sex Pistols. And they said, that's the student you need to reach. And I said, well, what if he's gifted? The impression was that this was this detached, disconnected student that was hard to reach and hard to teach. And it kind of sent a negative tone that, of that's the kid you have to reach. And I was like, what if he's gifted? What if that's the reason why, why he is how he is, what he is? I really think a lot of what I learned as a teacher came from just the natural talent or art of teaching, being able to teach, but also through professional development. And I didn't take to a lot of professional development. I took the professional development that I felt like I could take and make my own, but I never felt like I could do better than something, or I didn't need the professional development. It wasn't for me. And I think that's the hard part about a lot of teaching colleges, because I work in professional development now and I work with a lot of teachers, and they're not diving into the standards as much as they should be. What I'm hearing a lot of, I said, well, when you're in teaching college, well, what are you focusing on? What are you learning? Well, what's my objective? What's the anticipatory set? I'm like, Madeline Hunter? I mean, it's a great thing, but they're not going into the deep dive. And the sad thing is that I really think a lot of teachers, they get, especially new teachers, they really get the professional development, the education they need through professional development. And I think it's also a dilemma, because you have these new teachers who are learning stuff, and they learn from, you told me you're a professional development presenter and provider, and they learn from you and they learn from me, and they're learning valuable stuff. And then, unfortunately, a lot of times some other people on the staff are just like, oh, I don't need this. And it just kind of makes pollutes the whole experience. So I think the colleges need to do a little bit better with having the teachers not only understand the isms of teaching or the theories of teaching, but also, the pedagogy and practice of teaching. I really think they need to focus on understanding how to use standards, since we are a standard-driven system. I think behavior and social emotional learning is important, but I don't think one should be over the other. There should be a balanced approach of it. So I guess in a nutshell with mine, I kind of learned through experience. I don't think I really had a lot of great formal instruction, but I was fortunate enough to receive professional development that made me better as an educator. And I also thought creatively and critically about how I could use this and turn it into my own. That's what made me become a PD provider.
Yeah. Well, as a competitor, we're both, I guess that's one way to put it, providing professional learning, professional development. And, I always say our work is through the lens of inquiry. I'm also, as a teacher, I was, fairly cynical about professional development and, that sort of dynamic of, how long will this last, or what are we going to have to turn in? It's just not particularly well done kind of professional learning, which I suppose is ironic that, I do what I do now, but obviously trying to do it better and differently. I'm curious if you have any specific examples, or, like when you said some professional learning, some professional development was really impactful. Can you cite any that you recall that, like, oh, this, I remember this really made an impact on me. This made an impact on me.
If I can address something even first before that, when it comes to professional development and professional learning, you and I are not competitors. We're both we're doing the same thing, but we're not in competition with each other.
Mm-hmm.
We're supporting each other. And that's the thing, is that, it's kind of funny when I remind that about when I went in the film industry. They call it show business, but business actually got capitalized over the show, and that lost a lot of creativity of it. I mean, if you're out there doing the good work, and I'm out there doing the good work, and it's about sharing ideas, that's the thing. And that was the thing, when circling back to it, the professional development that I felt was not effective was when I felt like it was PD called product development, like they were selling me a program, or they were selling a product. The thing that really transformed me as an educator, I went to staff development for educators, SDE. They shut down now, but they used to have a conference in Las Vegas in the summer, a differentiated instruction conference. And what I used to joke around with, I said that conference was so great that I went to every session in Vegas. I got to see Rick Wormley there. I got to see Carolyn Coyle there. And they really transformed my teaching and really became people who really showed me the creative side of teaching. Because again, like when we go to teaching go to university, we learn a lot of theory, we learn a lot about the isms of teaching, we learn about the history of education, but we really don't learn how to really deliver that instruction. So from Rick, I learned a lot about differentiation. Carolyn Coyle, with her books, when she talked about she used to do this thing called multiple intelligence activities, and I kind of incorporate not only in my classroom but my PD, but taking to the next level. I think the thing is that a lot of times the unfortunate thing about professional development is that there's never enough time, and there's never ever enough funding to do it effectively. One of the things I'm actually talking about with people these days is that when people say, well, why don't you come in for 2 hours to train on depth of knowledge, DOK, or on questioning inquiry, that's a lot of pressure on not only the teachers but me, because it's the pressure on the teachers that have to be introduced to the concept, practice the concept, and be masters of it in 2 to 6 hours. And it's pressure on me that within 2 to 6 hours, I want to give you the very best, because you're paying top dollar for this. And I think that's the hard part with professional development. And the same with the conferences, is that you go to the conferences to learn, and you go to the conferences to grow professionally, but you also need to be committed to stay in the sessions. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I present, I'll see someone in the back on their phone. This isn't what I thought, or this isn't what it said in the in the agenda, or hey, God forbid if there's a conference in Anaheim or Orlando, because they're going to go choose. And actually, that's a joke I say. Thank you for choosing Mickey Mouse. You choosing me over Mickey Mouse, Buzz Lightyear, Darth Vader, and Iron Man. So I think that's the thing, is that the professional development has to be applicable, but the professional development also has to be personal. Like, I have to see the value of it. You can't just come in and do like, well, this is a PD for one and done for everybody. I mean, some people just don't take to it, and some people they may feel it doesn't fit their area, but that puts a lot of pressure on it, not only the participant but also the presenter as well.
Yeah, well, it is definitely a sort of unique challenge, as I'm sure you're well aware, right? We go into schools, and one of the things you want teachers to do is to have a sense of, what their students are capable of, what their prior academic achievement is, and all that kind of thing. And as professional development providers, we often, at least at the very best, it's a challenge to have that, an understanding of that before we walk in the door, and then being able to sort of adjust on the fly. Well, so the book, which is out this year, Inquiring Minds Want to Learn. I asked this question not out of any cynicism, but why do we need another inquiry book? What made you decide, I'm going to write this book and get this out here?
It's funny. I don't know if you talked to the editors, because I wanted to call this book not another book on questions, not another teen movie or something like that. Looking at it, and when I look at the books out there on questioning and on inquiry, it kind of goes in really interesting places. And what I wanted to try to do is really focus on not so much the active process of questioning inquiry, but really how to come up with that good question, what I call it, that really not only informs the instruction, but initiates the inquiry. And I see a lot of things about inquiry, and it's just very abstract. Like, it's almost like inquiry is a wonderful thing, but we really can't quantify what that looks like. And there's a lot of things, like even my own personal philosophy of inquiry is that you can't tell someone to engage in inquiry. You gotta, ask them to engage in inquiry. You gotta ask the question. You gotta ask the question that will stimulate different levels of thinking, that will, expand their knowledge, extend their thinking, or pique their curiosity, imagination, interest, and wonder, which is what three things I say a good question does. So I really want to come up with this process of not only how you can create the question, which is hard. Questioning is hard, and asking questions is hard. It's hard. It takes critical thinking. It takes creative thinking, but it also takes courage and confidence, because you have to be able to accept the silence, and you have to be able to embrace the silence and do something with it. So what I wanted to do with the book is really focus on how do you come up with those questions? How do you create those questions? And then how do you understand and use those questions to plan and provide teaching experiences and learning experiences through inquiry and by questioning. And it's really trying to teach people how to shift not only their instructional delivery, but also their attitude towards questions and questioning. And I think we also need to reteach ourselves how to ask questions and what the purpose of questions are. Because if you think about a child between the age of 2 and 5, how they learn and how they communicate is through questioning. And a lot of that is physiological with their brain and also social. But once they start to go to school, that the interaction between adults and children is still questioning and responding, but now it's the adults asking the questions primarily to assess. And the students realize that the purpose of questions is to answer, and it's not. So what I did with this book is try to say is that how do I get that question? How can I pose that question to get not only to assess learning, but also to activate, advance, and augment learning? And you're right, there's a lot of questioning books out there. I think what makes my books distinct is that I really focus on the question part of it. It's not about a bunch of activities. It's not about a bunch of engaging tasks you can perform. It's really about the idea of how do I ask a question to acquire the knowledge, to apply the knowledge, to analyze the knowledge, and augment my knowledge. How do I ask that question not only to take in, but also talk about and take into consideration, transfer my learning? And I think that's what makes my book distinct. There's a lot of great question books out there. I cite a number of them in my book. There's a lot of people out there also like, inquiry is a wonderful thing, and it's this abstract thing, and it's a bunch of engaging activities. But what do students really take away from it? Did that student, through that experience, are they really going to contact you 10, 15 years later from now and talk about what they learned through that experience? And I think that's what really makes it distinct.
Yeah, well, there are some interesting, uniquely interesting things in here. We'll talk about the way that you've sort of, revamped or revised the Bloom's taxonomy, and you've got sort of flipped it in some ways. And we talk about flipping Bloom's taxonomy, but in a different thing, and we can certainly talk about that. I do I have a lot of conversation. I think it's really interesting. I'm curious how you think about this. I think about on one end of the spectrum that sort of, direct or explicit instruction, science of learning kinds of approaches. On the other end, the more constructivist and inquiry-based. I think that there's in many ways, significant overlap. Maybe you think that, maybe you don't. But I try to make the case for the importance of inquiry and education, and I'm curious how do you justify, why do you think inquiry is so important for our teachers to be employing with their students?
Because we need to get our students curious and caring about what they're learning. I think that's the thing, is that you need to learn this. Do I really? Okay, well, wait a minute. What's interesting about this? What's important about this? What's essential about this? And that's tied into even when you look at prioritizing your standards. What's essential to learn, important to understand, or nice to know? And that's where I think inquiry can come in. And I think that's where we can also make inquiry student-centered. Again, I don't look at inquiry as an activity. I look at inquiry as an experience. And I look at inquiry not only from an intellectual standpoint, but also from an emotional standpoint, that you get curious about things you see, things you hear, things you think about. And the problem is, and we go back to when I was in school, was that I didn't care about what I learned, because I realized all I got to do is answer what my teacher told me, and just write down my notes and do what my teacher said, and I'm fine. Or, my teacher would tell me this is important to learn and understand. Well, I realized, no, it really isn't. So I think that's the big thing. And there's a lot of things out there with inquiry. And that's why in one part of the book, I talk about what I call the 7 forms of inquiry, that you have the traditional, which, everyone sees this, a lot of things out there, but they don't know where things came from. And the 4 traditional forms of inquiry that we engage in, which is, controlled inquiry, structured inquiry, guided inquiry, open free inquiry, That's been an inquiry model that started back in 1962 with Joseph Schwab and then got solidified in 71 by Marshall Heron. But you see this inquiry pool out there and you're like, okay, well, wow, that's great, but I don't know the why behind it. So I talk about it and I talk about the different forms of it, but actually since 2000, there's been 3 new forms of inquiry that have come out that are science, that are research based. You have what's called coupled inquiry, which is a combination of guided and open and free inquiry, which guided inquiry is teacher facilitated, and open and free inquiry is more student centered with less teacher facilitation. It's actually a great way to respond to intervention with inquiry. What do the kids need? Where do I need to step in? There's authentic inquiry, which is more the freewheeling, what I like to call true Socratic inquiry, where it's like, what question do you have? What do you want to examine and explore today? A lot of that was how we did inquiry back in the late 60s and early 70s with the open classroom, where it's like, hey man, what do you want to learn today? And you had a question. And then there's another one that just came out about 2019 called synergistic inquiry. And what that involves is not only is the student engaging in inquiry as a participant, but also the teacher is. And these are great for classes such as student government, when you have, a student council and they have to organize things, and that adult is a part of it, maybe that contact who needs to contact the other adults to get things done. So I think that's the thing, is that when it comes to inquiry, there is that scientific process, that structured process. But real true inquiry, I believe, is just tapping into the natural innate curiosity and caring to learn. That's where I look at inquiry. Like, for example, my simple thing of inquiry, my daughter and I were listening to Taylor Swift's new album, and I pay attention to the lyrics. I don't pay attention to the song as much as the lyrics. I try to find the meaning in it. And I was driving and I was listening to a Bruce Springsteen song, Hungry Heart, and it reminded me of Taylor Swift lyrics. And then I listened to Bon Jovi's You Give Love a Bad Name. I'm like, you know what? Taylor Swift could sing this song. See, that's inquiry. That's curiosity. That is me questioning, saying, so what is the similarities between Taylor Swift, Bruce Springsteen, and Bon Jovi's music? That's real inquiry. That's true inquiry. The purpose is I want to learn. The purpose is I want to understand, where something pop in my head and I see something, or I hear something, or I feel something, or I think something, and I want to learn. That's what I think true inquiry is. I don't, I do disagree with very structured programs like Socratic seminars. Okay, Socrates didn't put, one group in his inner circle, one group in the outer circle, and assign roles. That's classroom management. That's controlled inquiry. That's managing the class. Socrates should walk into, a coliseum, or walk into an area and pose the question and let the students play with it, and let the students, really, delve into it. That's real true inquiry. So the way I look at it from a teaching standpoint is I could walk in the classroom, ask a question, and have the kids just really delve deep into it, and I facilitate it. So, for example, I could walk in with a profound question and say, so how did Edgar Allan Poe create an entire genre of literary fiction? Okay, no answer. What if I told you that he was the first person to ever write a short story featuring a detective or a sleuth who used deductive logic and reasoning to solve a crime? Who does that sound like? And most kids would say Sherlock Holmes, if they know it. And then I'd say, well, what if I told you that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle actually based Sherlock Holmes on a character, that Edgar Allan Poe created 60 years before in a short story called Murders in the Rue Morgue? See, that's inquiry. That's me getting the kids wanting to learn more. And that's me wanting them to get out there and, hey, is Francis right? Is he not right? Mr. Francis, is he right or not right? Is he accurate or inaccurate? Or even refuting truths. One of my favorite lessons was I asked why, did Teddy Roosevelt start the U.S. Forestry Division? And I posed a question out there and said, isn't it kind of odd that he was a big game hunter and he was also a nature conservationist? See, I got you thinking. So now no one's really into it. And I say, well, what if I told you it's because he encountered a Sasquatch in the Pacific Northwest? And he hunted it down with the vim and vigor of a hunter. And he was worried that people would do what Ted Nugent does. You kill it, you grill it. He was worried about the fur traders at that time who were selling off furs, and it really wasn't mink coats, it was something else. Or he was worried about what Buffalo Bill did. And I asked the kids, what did Buffalo Bill almost hunt to extinction? They go, buffalo. And I'd say, is there buffalo and bison in America? And they go, bison. So it's self-correcting. So I say, that's the reason. What if I told you that's the reason why Teddy Roosevelt started the U.S. Forestry Division? Because he encountered a Sasquatch. And the kids are like, get out of here. And I said, Google it. Because Google's a way of life now. So they Google it. They find out that's not the reason. But they also find out there's a book called Teddy Roosevelt wrote called The Wilderness Hunter, that he talks about this thing called the Bauman incident, in which this fur trader Bauman talks about his camp being attacked by an ape-like creature in 1898. So now my kids are invested in it. Now my kids are like, Mr. Francis, if we find that book, can we read it? If you find it, go for it. Well, digital natives, they found it. We read it. They want to learn. When I had them go and write a paper, what kind of text can you write and present that talks about Teddy Roosevelt's impact and influence on history and the present? My little creative screenwriter in the class said he wanted to write a movie called Teddy Roosevelt's Sasquatch Hunter. And he said, history says this is the reason why he started U.S. Forestry Division, but this is the real story. See, he learned. And that's what I mean by inquiry. That's what I mean by questioning. That's why our kids are so detached from learning now. They're even detached from life. They're all in their phones. They're all, kind of in their, how can I get my kids invested? That's what inquiry does. And you have to be, again, a critical and creative thinker and courageous and confident enough. I mean, when I taught math, how can we create a football plays using linear equations? Kids look at me like, what? And I brought in math and football, and I laid a graph. I said, okay, your x-axis is your offensive line, your y-axis is your quarterback to the end zone. Graph those plays how could you graph those plays as linear equations? What if I told you that's what they remember 20 years later? That's what I mean by inquiry. How can you be creative to get that kid to want to learn?
So I'm imagining the folks who are critical of inquiry, and your last example maybe is one that they might appease them a little bit, but of course they often want to really be clear, like, okay, we've got standards, we've got content, we've got to check, we've got to assess, we need to build knowledge, and specific knowledge, not just what they might be interested in this day or that day. And so I'm imagining hearing you talk about the inquiry process the way you just did, and say, yeah, that's all well and good, but how do you get into the nuts and bolts? Like, what does if you're looking at standards, how do you sort of suggest with teachers that they go about the process of planning for that intentional encounter of the things that a curriculum, content standards, accountability standards, those kinds of things are sort of demanding of?
You're absolutely right. So one of the interesting things that I talk about is that we need to change how we communicate in our classroom. Again, what I like to say is that teachers, we do three things. We present information, we provide instructions, and we pose questions primarily for assessment. One of the simplest thing, and when I do this with teachers, I'm training your brain to look at the world through a lens of inquiry and questioning. Standards are objectives. They are imperative statements. When I do a professional development, I say, when you present the standard, you sound like Arlie Emery in Full Metal Jacket. You will learn by the numbers I will teach you. And that's why there's some hostility about that. But if you put three question stems in front of all your standards and all your objectives, you will create a standards-driven question. So the first question stem, I say, put in front of your standards. So let's say fluently multiply multi-digit numbers using an algorithm. How do you fluently multiply multi-digit numbers using an algorithm? Now I created a question for assessment, and they're going to have to explain that, and they're going to use their problems as examples, not exemplars, but examples. So I fluently multiply multi-digit numbers using place value understanding. For example, in question number 1, I did this. In example, question number 2, I did. That's real true assessment with that. My philosophy is that true learning, the mark and measure of true learning is not whether you can just demonstrate it, whether you can communicate it, whether you can teach it or tell it to someone else. The other thing you can do is you can put, how can you? So if I say, how can you fluently multiply multi-digit numbers using an algorithm? Now I have the instructional focus and the purpose for learning. And what I often encourage teachers to do is, instead of doing learning targets that say, I can, which basically you're putting words in a kid's mouth, I can fluently multiply multi-digit numbers using an algorithm, okay? Students are either going to say, no, I can't, or they're just going to read it verbatim off the board just because they have to. But if I say to you, how can you fluently multiply multi-digit numbers using an algorithm? Now I've got your brain. I'm inviting you into the instruction instead of saying, I can do this. Now it's, how can you? I don't know. Okay, well, what is it that you don't know and understand up there? Well, what's an algorithm? Okay, write that down as a question. Well, what do you mean by standard? What does fluently mean? That's a way to get the kids questioning at that, using that standard as a prompt or a stimulus. The other is, and this is my favorite, and I try not to talk about it first, because I like to put how could you? Because if I put how could you in front of every standard, now I have a question for inquiry. Because if I say, how could you fluently multiply multi-digit numbers using an algorithm? Well, that kind of means there could be more than one way to do it. And I get to choose which way I want to do it. Because I may not be able to do it by stacking factors. I may be able to do it by using lattice. And I may be able to do it by doing the stick method that came out of Asia. Is it important for me to be able to communicate how I can do what I can do and why I can do it? And that's the way I look at it. So the whole thing about, well, I have to teach the standards. Well, the standard is the question. You have to rephrase it into an interrogative statement. And sometimes you have to find the question stem that's hidden in the standard. So if I said, for example, explain, so I'll do an ELA one, analyze how the elements of literature interact with each other. For example, how setting shapes the plot or how plot shapes the characters. Well, there's a question word in there, how. And if I remove the Bloom's verb, I'll have my question. How do literary elements impact and influence each other? How does setting shape the plot? That's what I mean by being creative with that. The whole thing, like, well, I have to teach the standards. Yeah, you have to teach the standards, but if you turn the standards into a question, you'll have actually a more authentic measure, because the question items you give them, they're not even questions, they're items. Think of it like pitches in baseball. Your objective is to hit the ball in the pitches that are thrown at you. And the question is, how could you hit the ball when these pitches are thrown at you? And then I'll throw this pitch and I'll throw this pitch, and sometimes I'll hit it and sometimes I won't, but that doesn't mean I can't hit. See? So that's the way I look at it, is that you have to rephrase your standards into questions. Easiest way to do it is to put how do you, how can you, or how could you in front of it. And then when you get a little bit better at it, then what you can do is look for the question word in the standard and remove the verb. Or if you see a Bloom's verb, and then you talked about that inverted Bloom's pyramid, what is the question stem that gets the kids to think at that level? So most verbs that are associated with the Bloom's level of understand ask the kids how or why. And so if I see understand that the failures of the Articles of Confederation led to the writing of the United States Constitution, okay, well, how did the failures of the Articles of Confederation lead to the writing of the United States Constitution? So again, that takes training, that takes art, and that takes skill, and it takes time. I don't know if you're going to learn that in a one-day PD, but one thing I can teach you in a one-day PD is take all your standards and put how do you, how can you, and how could you in front of it for those purposes. And then a teacher will say to me, well, can I say how could you to assess, instruct, and to do inquiry? Yeah, sure. Okay, now you've learned. Well, I don't like the way that's phrased. Okay, well, how would you phrase as a question without you? I want to ask this. Okay, so now see what I'm doing there? I'm trying to change your instructional delivery. And even when you do lecture, one of the things I'm doing now in my PD is that I start the PD, I say, I want you to write down something that's essential to learn, important to understand, or nice to know about the subject you're teaching. And I give them an index card, and they write it down on the index card, the line part. And then what I have them do is flip over the card and say, what if I told you? And then they have to share that. For example, if I said, Edgar Allan Poe was the first author to write a detective mystery story, that's how I'd lecture. But if I flip my card over and say, what if I told you Edgar Allan Poe was the first author to write a detective mystery story, now you're inviting them into the instruction. And I said, watch the look on their face. Because when we lecture to kids, like I'm lecturing right now, people are like, mm-hmm. But if I say, what if I told you that if you put what if I told you in front of all your declarative statements, you'll be engaging in inquiry because you're inviting the kids to think about what you're saying.
There was a couple threads there I'd like to pull on, but you mentioned, and I do want to ask you to sort of unpack the questioning inverted Bloom's questioning inverted pyramid that I mentioned earlier, and you just referred to there. So most folks will remember or think of it as the sort of pyramid with the pointiest at the top, and you've got it flipped with the broadest at the top and the smallest at the bottom. Can you kind of talk us through your thinking, and you, I'm sure, can do a better job of describing it than I am with my pointiness and broadness.
No, you're doing a great job. And that's the thing. So the inverted pyramid is basically like baseline with questioning. First of all, let's talk about Bloom's taxonomy. A lot of people use that to create their questions. But Benjamin Bloom never intended that taxonomy to be used as a questioning framework. You know, he created it to categorize the complexity of objectives or behaviors. And what's really funny is we talked about earlier, Dr. Tom Liguski, who is a colleague and a friend, who talks about Bloom's taxonomy, often referenced and highly misrepresented between that and the DOK wheel. And for depth of knowledge. And what's really interesting, and I have the book over here, it was not Benjamin Bloom who said, use my taxonomy for questions. It was actually a guy named Norris Sanders in a book that he wrote in the 1960s called Quality Questions, What Kind? Or I forget the exact name of it, but his name was Norris Sanders. And what he wrote about was that Bloom's taxonomy was a great way to categorize the complexity of your questions, but it's not basically like a Canaan process. It's not the perfect taxonomy for that. So when addressing that, what I did was I just basically took every question stem and categorized it and correlated it to the level of thinking in Bloom's taxonomy, and very loose. So the idea behind it, and the way it is in the book, and it's kind of evolved since I first did in my first book, now that's a good question, is that I changed remember to recognize, because that's more of an active thinking process. It's more of a performance. Kids don't remember. I like to say, what if I said that kids don't remember stuff, they remember experiences? But recognize is the active learning. It's how you acquire knowledge. It's how you attain knowledge. And then going through it, I also brought synthesize back. And synthesize, I put between the levels of evaluate and create as the level that transitions from, okay, here now I'm asking questions about the content, the concepts, and procedures. Now I'm going to synthesize, which means how do I bring it together to make it my own? And create is the expression of learning and how I do things. So the idea behind synthesize, that's the social emotional level. That's where you're asking, what do you think? How do you feel? What do you believe? And it's kind of also interesting because now you're moving away, and Tom Gusky and I just had this conversation that when you start talking about feelings, now you're not talking about the cognitive domain of Bloom's, you're talking about the affective domain of Bloom's, of receiving, responding, valuing, organizing, characterizing. That's what it means to synthesize your learning to make it your own, and create is the expression of how you've made that learning. You take it in base level, you talk about it, you take it in consideration, and then you transfer it to make it your own. So that's how I created that framework. And what you do is you correlate it, that verb. So if I see a verb that's categorized under analyze, well, what's the question stems that get me to analyze? And that's the interesting thing about all these frameworks out there, not just Bloom's taxonomy, but also, I mean, the levels of questions, the house of questions. What's really funny is that it's all full of verbs. And questioning is not about the verb. Questioning is about the question stem. So what I did again in that book is I changed the house of questions or level questions by Art Costa and categorized the questions based upon which questions are for input, which questions are for process, and which questions are for output. So that's how we retrain ourselves to ask questions. That's how we really need to focus on that. We need to get away from telling kids to do this or telling the kids, this is what you need to know and understand, and start posing questions that get them thinking about their learning and wanting to learn, curious and caring.
So one of the things that people, I think, would be surprised, not if they had listened to me talk or read my blog pieces and things that I've written in our like project-based learning work and inquiry work, is that I think that there is a very real place for direct or explicit instruction inside the inquiry process or project-based learning experiences. So people will be like, they will sometimes say, if I used to think this, but now I think that, and now I think that's one of those things. I'm curious, what might people be surprised to read about, or if they're in one of your sessions, your workshops, working with you, that they might be surprised to realize, or maybe we can use recognize.
Yeah. Well, I'd say realize. I think one of the things people realize a lot when I work with them is that questioning is hard. It is hard from a cognitive perspective, and it's hard from an affective perspective. And it's not the activity, it's the experience, it's the delivery. I mean, I like to quote Eric Clapton and say, it's in the way that you use it. So when I ask you, what is 2 + 2? And you would say to me,
4.
And I say, you're right, but why? See, that's the important learning. And that's something I've actually learned lately, and I've had to rethink, because a lot of times I would say, what do you mean? And a lot of people feel like, oh, that sounds like it's attacking. And I say, well, what would you say instead? I say, explain. Well, that doesn't sound like it's attacking. That doesn't sound like, you're being confrontational. So it's in the way that you use it. Like if I said to you, who's the first president of the United States? You would say to me,
George Washington.
And I'd say, what do you mean? And then you'd be like, well, what does he mean? What do I mean? Mm-hmm. And I say, well, you're right, but why was he the first president of the United States? And then you would maybe say, because he was elected. Oh, you're right. But what if I told you there were 8 who were appointed before him under the Articles of Confederation? And then my history teachers love to tell me, well, they weren't really presidents. Well, you're right, but why? Because they didn't have executive power. You're right, but why? Well, because they were more of a figurehead position. And when they had Washington and they elected Washington, that's where the position was given more executive power. See, that's how they're learning. My question is bringing out the learning. My question is basically making an experience to basically go and say, ooh, this is not something I need to learn. This is something I want to learn. And I think with teachers, the problem is when it comes to questioning is that we're often using it primarily for assessment. No, that we have enough tests that assess learning. Let's ask some questions to activate, advance, and augment learning. And I think that's the thing. It's like people see it and they get it, but they're not confident about it. Like, I see what you're saying, but, and I even say this, okay, complete this statement. How could you complete this statement for saying, I see what you're saying, it looks and sounds good because, or I see what you're saying, it looks and sounds good, but, and that's engaging them in questioning and inquiry. Again, it's a mind shift. It's really how you use it. And there's a lot of times, like you mentioned multiple books out there. I see books out there that have questions in the title, and they're really books about inquiry, because inquiry is the experience and the activity. Questioning is what you do to engage in it, and asking questions is what fosters and fuels the inquiry. If I say to you for project-based learning, go and determine how the impact of rainfall has impacted the state of Kentucky. Okay, that's inquiry, but I'm telling you to do it. But if I ask you the question, that's really true inquiry, because that's what you have to do. That's when you talk about project-based learning, that's when it comes into that driving question where, you're asking the questions that not only serve as the assessment, but also set the instructional focus. And that's also something I talk about when people talk about essential questions. And I ask people, what makes a question essential? What's an essential question? And it really depends on who you read, because Wiggins and McTighe say this, and they're right, but why? Ted Sizer, who came up with it, says this, but why? And John Larmer with, the Buck Institute says it's the driving question that initiates a project-based learning experience. He's right, but why? Okay. So that's why I came up with the concept of good questions. It's not the question you're asking, it's in the way that you use it. And I think that's the thing when teachers look at that and they go, So I can ask any question, and it depends on how I use it. And that's what makes the questioning inquiry happen. I go, exactly. And that takes a lot of onus off the teachers.
Yeah. So again, playing devil's advocate, because I'm thinking.
I want to play devil's advocate.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, so you're asking 2 + 2, and what was your you said explain, but what was the phrasing that you used as a response? And when
you're right, but why?
You're right, but why? Yeah. So I can imagine the sort of science of learning folks would say, all right, yeah, that's all well and good, but that's terribly inefficient, right? So efficiency being something that's very, very valuable to them, very prioritized. I don't know if you feel like that's inefficient, or if you feel like efficiency is something that's not as important as other things. How do you kind of think through those kinds of dynamics?
I think it's not so much the problem I'm giving you. I think it's, can you explain how you solve that problem? Can you justify why it's correct or incorrect? So it's not the 2 + 2. You know what 2 + 2 is. I've seen a first grader do this. I work with a school out here in rural Arizona, and I walked in, and the student said to me, "Hey, Mr. Francis, I know what 1,000 + 1,000 is." But what is it? He goes, 2,000. I go, all right, you're right, but why? Because when I have 1 and 1 and I combine them, I make 2. And I have 3 zeros after the 1, so I bring it down. So I know I got a 4-digit number there. This is the kid talking to me, first grade. And this is not a gifted kid, because if it was a gifted kid, he wouldn't be able to explain it. He would just tell me the answer, because gifted kids have a hard time communicating. But that's the true transferable learning. And I quizzed him. I go, okay, so what's 5,000 + 7,000? And he thought, and he goes, 12,000. I said, you're right, but why? And then he said, well, 5 + 7, when I combine it, I make 12. And I got 3 digits, so I brought them down. Now I got a 5-digit number, and now it's a 10,000, so it's not 1,200, it's 12,000. This is this true learning that kids need to do. It's not the pitches in baseball you get thrown at. It's, can you explain how you hit that ball? Can you justify why you hit the ball that way? Or can you think critically and creatively about different ways to hit that ball? Can you explore and extend different ways you can hit a ball? That's the thing. Science of learning, and when they talk about that, again, you're looking a lot about measure. And a lot of times, a lot of things we measure is based upon accuracy or acceptability. But is that the fact that maybe they got thrown a good pitch, or maybe they're having a good day, or maybe they got thrown a bad pitch, or they're having a bad day? One of the things I encourage teachers to do is, when you get the state assessment back, or you get an item back from your summative assessments or formative assessments, first of all, you got to look at that item and see how closely did it address and assess the standard, because it might not address it fully. Secondly, if you can basically prove that that child knows deeply how and why they can use what they've learned to answer a question, address a problem, accomplish a task, or analyze a task, or analyze a text or topic, or they can justify with evidence why that's the answer, or refute it, or make all these connections, that's the true measure of learning. Okay? I mean, look, Tom Brady didn't connect with the football. Derek Jeter struck out, and Michael Jordan missed baskets. They're still GOATs. They're still the greatest of all time, and they know how to. I mean, so you can't really just say, well, they got this item incorrect. Well, you threw a baseball pitch at them. How do we know that they hit the ball out? I really believe the true measure of learning is your ability to communicate your learning. So when I did that with you, you're right, but why? It doesn't matter 2 + 2 is. I can get that off my calculator on my phone. But can you explain how addition can be used, so I give you any problem that you'll be able to solve it? And language is important. And what's interesting is, when I work with K-2 teachers, you know what they call a lot of times addition? Grouping. And I say, no, that's multiplication, not addition. So language is important. Let me show you another one. Could 2 + 2 = 5?
There are some folks who say yes.
Okay, they're right, but why?
I don't understand their. I don't know why they think they're right. It doesn't make sense to me.
Right. So you don't think. So what I'm hearing you say is, you don't think 2 + 2 could equal 5.
Correct.
You're right, but why?
Because I can add things and put them together and count.
Right. So what would I need to do to make 2 plus 2 equal 5?
Bend the laws of physics.
Okay. Or using addition, what could I do?
I don't know. I don't know.
You have to add one more, right? Most people say, well, you have to add one more to make it 5.
Oh,
great. So you
yeah.
understand the concept of addition. Now, what if I use addition, decimals, and rounding? Could 2 plus 2 equal 5? Now I got you thinking. It's not about the answer. I've given you the answer. 2 plus 2 could equal 5. You got to justify why using addition, decimals, rounding. Now, I'm going to tell you that I was blasted with that. I call it blasted. I was heckled. Talking in front of 400 Texans about questioning. And I said, what's 2 plus 2? And somebody said to me, 5. And I said, what do you mean? It goes, 2 plus 2 could equal 5. I go, what do you mean? She goes, well, you're going to do it. And she did this. She goes, what's 2.4 rounded? I go, 2. She goes, what's 2.3 rounded? I go, 2. What's 2.4 plus 2.3? I said, 4.7. She goes, rounded. I said, 5. She goes, see, 2 plus 2 could equal 5. Now, this was meant to embarrass me. Okay, I was heckled. But my curious mind, my inquiring mind said, what allows me to do that in math? Because I know every time I get confronted with math, it's always like, where's the mathematical, concept that proves that? And she said, that's estimation with triangles. And she was right. So it's not so much the answer, because answers come free. I can Google an answer. ChatGPT now explains answers to me. Can I think critically? Can I summarize my own words? What is the answer and why? Can I justify why it's accurate or inaccurate, or think critically and creatively about different and deeper ways that I can use what I've learned? Can I explore and extend what I learned? That's the thing about questioning. We talk about the science of learning. I would say, what's the purpose of learning with the science of learning? I would look and say, what's that social emotional aspect? Why learn? And it's not just so much to get my degree or to pass a test or anything. How do I make that something that I learn with life? How do I make it where I'm going to have an open mind about things? How am I going to make it where I rethink and unlearn, which when we talked about off the air, that's a big thing with this book, Think Again. In this day and age where we're constantly being bombarded by ideas and information, the true mark of deep and critical and creative thinking is the ability to rethink and unlearn. And that's what he talks about in there. When our ideas become ideologies or we don't question, he tells a great story in there about Albert Einstein, how Einstein said, I became everything I always stood against. And all these scientists said, but you're Albert Einstein. You created theory of relativity. You're a genius. We all agree with you. And he goes, exactly. You don't question me. And that's the true thing. We need to think like a scientist, because scientists don't say, why am I right? The scientist says, why could I be wrong?
So I agree with that, all of that, with the question that I'm sure others would have formulated as you're talking, and just to give you the opportunity to clarify. So do you think that kids should have sets of knowledge and that is important, that they know 2 plus 2 equals 4 or their times tables and those kinds of things, because that's one of the criticisms that I think people will level at more constructivist educators. They say, oh, you can just Google everything, which is true, but it seems to me that there's real value in having sets of knowledge and fluency in certain things, right?
Mm-hmm. Of course. And really, it's not about isms. It's about, if I had to say it's an ism, I would say more it's about individualism. What does that student need? What will help that student? I think that's the thing, is that we say kids need this, kids need that. If you can Google a question, it's a bad question. That's not true, because actually Google is a way of life. And every time the technology advances, we need to challenge ourselves to think deeper. We can't make the same mistake with Google that we're making with ChatGPT, which is, we banned Google. Google's bad. Well, Google's a way of life. Because if I asked you right now, what are all the 50 states in alphabetical order in their capitals? Once upon a time, we could probably memorize it off our head. Maybe some people can even sing the song, but most people will Google it. ChatGPT explains it. But the thing is this, we need to think critically about the responses that we're given. I mean, I've been playing with AI with a lot of things, and I look at a lot of things out there with AI platforms. For example, I look at a lot of things about AI platforms. There's things called DOK question generators. Magic School has one. School AI has a whole thing about DOK. My question is this: what's vetting that resource? Where are they getting that information from? And I asked the AI, where are you getting your information from? And AI will tell you most of their research goes back to 2021 or 2022. Well, there's been new information and recent research on DOK that's kind of not only brought to light some truths and some inaccuracies about what we've been taught, but also expanded it and evolved it. And we need to think critically about the answers we're given. And that's the whole thing when I talk about that base knowledge. Is it great to have kids know their times table? Absolutely. Is it great that kids can know what 2 + 2 is? Absolutely. But why? We don't question why. We don't, and that actually is what gets us in trouble with a lot of things in life, especially in education, where if you ever talk to people who are the people who created the frameworks and the processes, they'll tell you, you've taken my work and turned it into something that I never intended to be. And that's not what it is. And that's what I mean by asking questions to get kids curious. Well, why is 2 + 2 = 4? Because it just is. Okay, well, why? Because if I know 2 + 2, I'll know what 2,000 + 2,000 is, and I'll know what 2 million + 2 million is, and I'll know what 2 billion + 2 billion is, because you know what? I understand addition. And that's why we need to ask ourselves, what's essential to learn, what's important to understand, and what's nice to know. And that doesn't come from us as teachers. That comes from the kids. And it's funny because I actually do a thing where I show a multiplication problem and I label the parts. And I say, okay, here's the factors, here's the multiplicand, here's the multiplier, here's the product. What's essential to learn, what's important to understand, what's nice to know? Product. Why? Because that's the answer. It meets the real criteria. Readiness, endurance, assessed, leverage. What about factors? Well, that's important to understand in 5th grade. And then the science teachers will say to you, well, wait a minute, we talk about factoring. Now that's become essential to learn because it has leverage and endurance. Okay. What about multiplicand and multiplier? Now that's nice to know. Well, what if for that student to help them understand what multiplication is? Because you ask the kids what multiplication is, they'll either say 2 things, three things, repeated addition, grouping, or times. They have no idea what that means. But if I can have a student understand that the multiplicand is the first number, and that's the constant, and the multiplier tells me how many times the multiplicand needs to be added to itself or grouped to get my product, I now understand the concept of multiplication. And the teacher might go, well, that's just getting into the weeds. That's just, what if that's what the student needs? It's not about me. It's about what the student needs and what the student wants. That's what I look at questioning and inquiry.
Well, maybe the last question here is, in some ways, maybe a flip of some of the questions and things we've talked about, is what are some of the pitfalls or things that can go wrong, or that when you talk about, hey, it's really important to do inquiry and some of the ways in which you talked about it, but we talk about inquiry and say, but you want to make sure this is happening, or you want to make sure not to do this, like thinking about how much guidance we're going to give kids, and if they're ready, what level of autonomy or what level of inquiry they're ready for, based on cognitive complexity or prior academic achievement, those kinds of things. So when you are working with teachers, what are some of the things that you say, don't do this, or be careful of this, or these are pitfalls, kinds of things?
One of the things I talk about, it's actually a great line, I didn't come up with it, it was from a Peloton instructor. He says, I make suggestions, you make decisions. And that's the thing. One of the pitfalls I say, so I talk about what bad questions are. Bad questions are what we call dichotomous or polar questions. Yes, no, true, false, agree, disagree, because I call them conversation cognition killers, because once you give the answer, it's over. And there's 4 ways I can answer it. Yes, no, I don't know, and I don't care. Okay. But if I make it open-ended where they can communicate, that makes a good question. Another bad question I talk about is, and this is on assessments, trick questions. Which one? Okay. Those are not good questions. That's meant to trick. That's meant to confuse. People think it's meant to critically think, but we are taught in life that there's only one answer to a question when it comes to school and when it comes to assessment. Now it's like, which one? And if they pick just 1 out of the 2 or 1 out of 3, aren't they partially correct? But no, we ding them because we didn't give them, they didn't pick all the ones that it could possibly be. All right. So you need to basically say, okay, here are 3 options. Why are they accurate or appropriate? That's, what I call with trick questions. The other thing about it is watch out for leading questions. So if I say to you, should the death penalty be abolished? I'm presenting one side of it. I need to give you choice. Should the death penalty be abolished? Legally permitted, depends on the situation. Loaded questions is when I'm trying to really influence your thinking. Like, well, why is Huckleberry Finn so inappropriate? Well, maybe it's not. Maybe it's just the interpretation of it. And multiple choice questions. That's where I say get into the pitfalls of it. Avoid those pitfalls with it. You want to see what the student can do with the question. And you use questions and questioning. So, for example, one of the things I do is I tell teachers, I said, you are going to achieve a high school standard in 5 minutes, and you're not a math teacher. And the standard says, explain why the product of a non-zero rational number and irrational numbers are rational. I said, how many of you can do that right now? And they don't. I said, okay, what is the product of a non-zero number and a non-zero rational number and irrational number? They can't answer it. I said, okay, what is the word that stands out to you there? Product. What does product mean? Multiplication. So what are we doing with those numbers? Multiplying them. We just went from high school to 3rd grade. Bring it back. Okay, let's talk about this. What's a rational number? I don't know. What's an irrational number? One that's not rational. Great, but what's a rational number? I don't know. What does rational mean? Okay, not sure. What does irrational mean? Not sure. Okay, what's a non-zero number? Any number that's non-zero. Good. Let's start there. They give me it. They give me the example. They explain why. We create classroom rules. Then we bring it back. So rational numbers must mean what? They make sense. Irrational means what? They don't make sense. So what kind of numbers don't make sense? What do you do when a student says fractions? Okay, what's a fraction? They'll give you an example. Well, what is a fraction? Part of a whole. Okay, so has anyone ever taught you that? What if I told you a fraction is actually a division problem? You take the denominator, you divide it into the numerator. If I take 1/2 and divide 2 into 1, what do I get? 0.5. Is there any numbers after that? No. Okay. Then I take 2/3 and I get 0.6666. That's called a repeating decimal. So a rational number, and again, I'm talking like this right now, but this is the way the students are talking. Okay. So they know that a terminal decimal is a number that can be expressed as a terminal decimal is a rational number. And a number that's expressed as a repeating decimal is a rational number. But when you got those numbers at 3.141528, that's pi, that's irrational because the numbers keep on going, they differ. So when I say to you, what's -1/2 times pi? The teachers all say irrational. And I say, why? And go, because pi is irrational. And I said, 5 minutes ago, you couldn't do that. See? That's the thing. Presume nothing. Don't look at what you need to do to teach. Look at what the kids need to do to learn. And that's a mind shift with everything, I think, in teaching. I think sometimes teachers are like, how am I supposed to teach this? We need to reshift that focus. What if I said, instead of saying, how am I supposed to teach this, say, how are the students supposed to learn it? Where are they in their learning? Can I ask them a question and they can address it? And if they say, I don't know, and that's fine. I mean, I like I don't know because it opens the doorway to understanding, communication. Well, what is it you don't know and understand? All of it. Okay, so you don't know what the word the means? No, I know that. Okay, that's part of it. Do you know what that word is? Yeah. Okay, you know half of it. What is it that you don't understand? I don't understand this. Okay, let's look and find out what it is. That's what I mean by inquiry. Inquiry is not just about doing learning. It's about experiencing learning through questioning with good questions.
So the book is Inquiring Minds Want to Learn, Posing Good Questions to Promote Student Inquiry. I imagine you have some links and things you want to share. So where should they find you? Find the book. It's a Solution Tree book, so I'm imagining it's on their page. But where else?
Well, Again, you can find me on Solution Tree, solutiontree.com. The webpage for the book is actually called solutiontree.com/inquiring minds. My webpage is called Maverick, Maverik, education.com. There's no C in Maverick, no C in Eric. You can find me on Twitter, X, whatever they're calling it, as Maverick, Maverik, edu12. Again, no C in Maverick, Maverik, edu12. And email me out there with my email is Erik, Erik, at Maverick, Maverik, education.com. And, the last thing I want to say about questioning is that we need to change how we view and use questions as adults. And we need to have our kids question like they're 2 to 5 years old again. And as a joking thing, what I like to say is that when you ask the questions to the kids, I like to say, well, that's kind of like our revenge. Because remember that child you had between the age of 2 and 5? Remember all those questions they asked you? Why? Now we're going to ask them. You're right, but why? So now we're flipping the script on them.
All right. Well, Erik Francis, I appreciate the conversation. Obviously, we share a lot of common, threads on inquiry and the importance of that. The book is definitely worth a look. Lots of resources, and as I was saying before we hit the record button, lots of examples and charts, and I guess I'll just leave it at resources inside the book. So certainly worth picking up, and we'll put those links in the show notes. And again, I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.